Poker players, this is Steve Subready again. Today we will discover how to set mine in low stakes cash games. I have restricted this advice to low stakes games because recreational players in low stakes games are much more prone to stack off with less than premium hands. This makes set mining much more profitable in low stakes games than it is against a table of tough mid stakes players. I will also provide a few tips at the end on how to adapt our cash game set mining strategy to tournament situation. Let's get started. So what is set mining? Set mining is said to be the calling of a preflop raise with the sole intention of flopping a set to win the pot. But we can also include limping with a small pair since our implied odds are usually excellent in an unraised pot. Many pundits ignore this because limping is generally considered a bad play in a tough game and is rarely part of a GTO strategy. For example, game theory doesn't recommend playing small pairs at all in early or middle position, but game theory does allow opening or folding, since limping is not plus EV against strong GTO players. But a low stakes cash game, or even a tournament, can present situations for which limping for set value can be just fine. Suppose we are dealt pocket twos on the button. 3 players limp and we limp behind. The flop is 9-7-2. Sometimes old-time players will call this 3 of a kind, but this is more correctly called a set of twos. Suppose we had started with ace 2 suited. The flop is 9-deuce-deuce. This is also 3 of a kind, but this is more properly called trips. You might ask, what's the difference? But these two holdings are quite different, even though we have 3 of a kind in both cases. No one else can have the same set that we have, but another player could also have trip twos. In a situation like this, we have the best kicker to go along with the trips, but that's not always the case. If we had completed in the small blind with, say, 10 deuce suited, our hand would be more vulnerable to a better better trips. Words are important if you want to accurately communicate your strategy. In this lecture, we will be discussing only set mining. Set mining can only be profitable in a cash game when we have sufficient implied odds. So the first thing we need to know is, what are the chances of flopping a set when we start with a pocket pair? Of course, we can just memorize the odds, but it's better to know how to estimate them. Consider the rule of twos, which can be stated as, the chances of hitting an out on the next card is approximately 2%. For example, if we have pocket twos, we have only 2 outs to make a set, the deuce of diamonds and the deuce of hearts. So with 50 unseen cards, our chances of hitting a 2 on the next card is just 2 divided by 50, or 4%. This is where the rule of twos comes from. So by the rule of twos, our chances of flopping a set with 3 cards to be dealt is just 4% plus 4% plus 4%, which is equal to 12%. Now the chances of hitting the set on the second card isn't exactly 4%, since there are only 49 remaining unseen cards at that point. But the rule is quite accurate enough for real-time estimates. In fact, our actual chances of flopping exactly a set are 11.8%, which is very close to the rule. And our chances of flopping a set or better is slightly higher at 12%. We really should be considering sets plus rather than just sets, since when we flop quads, we don't need to even worry about reverse implied odds, which we will discuss later. So it's just fine to remember that we will flop a set or better once every 8 times in the long run. Nitpickers be damned. This means that we will fail 7.3 times for every time we succeed. So the profit we make when we flop a set must make up for the failures when we don't. So we must average at least 7.3 times our investment when we flop a set. This assumes we will never make a profit when we miss. And it also assumes that we never lose a pot when we flop the set. But we know that neither of these assumptions is correct. So we must adjust our set mining criteria depending on the situation. That's where the word implied comes from in implied odds. Either way, set mining provides the best odds we will ever have when trying to flop a big hand. which is 2 pair or better. For example, flopping a flush is only 0.8% likely. Flopping it straight with a connector is 1.3% likely. And flopping 2 pair with both hold cards is 2%. It's no surprise that the donkeys like to set mine because the odds are so good. There are many factors that affect our set mining prospects. One factor that is often mentioned is the size of the effective stacks. If we can't win enough chips when we flop a set, we can't set mine profitably. This is tied closely to the concept of implied odds. Our implied odds are improved when we have the potential to win a larger pot. Let's look at some heads-up examples. Suppose we must call a $10 bet with only $50 behind. Even if we win another $50 every time that we flop a set, we cannot make enough money to be profitable. Or perhaps we call a $30 bet with only $150 behind. Since we can only win another $150, we can only win 6 times our investment, which is unprofitable. These are 2 examples that are not uncommon in low-stakes cash games. Finally, suppose we call a $30 bet with $270 behind, which is not an uncommon situation in a 1-3 cash game. Now we could theoretically make enough profit, but that assumes we make the maximum profit up to 75% of the time we flop a set, depending on how much we make the rest of the time. And it doesn't include reverse implied odds, which we will talk about later. That seems rather unlikely when we are heads up, even in a very soft 1-3 cash game. So poker pundits have come up with the 15x rule, which I call the stack off leverage rule. In a heads-up battle, when we will have position, the effective stack should be at least 15 times our investment in order to set mine profitably. Some pundits increase this to 20x and others drop it to only 12x, but these pundits rarely specify the conditions for their rules. Perhaps the recommendation applies to different circumstances. There is one other factor worth mentioning here. If we have a set mining opportunity that is not quite good enough with 15x stacks, 30x stacks does not make it more profitable. Studies have shown that our set mining EV does not improve with stack size as long as it satisfies the rule. Another important factor is whether the hand was raised pre-flop or just limped. We need more stack off leverage in the raised pot. One reason for this is that we usually face fewer villains in the raised pot, and they tend to be more cautious post-flop when the pot gets larger, so they become less likely to stack off. This means that the stacks must be larger in the raised pot. The larger the bet we must call, the higher the leverage we need, because small stakes players become more conservative as the pot size increases. With a stack off leverage of 15x, for example, we need 37 big blind effective stacks to cold call a 2.5 big blind bet, which is typical for an online NL50 cash game. This is small enough that the pot sizes are not likely to intimidate our opponents. But it requires effective stacks of 75 big blinds to call a 5 big blind 3-bet or bet, which is common in a 1-2 cash game. Since an opponent is less likely to give us 75 big blinds than 37, the stack-off rule should be larger for this larger bet. Cold calling a 3-bet is even less attractive. If the 3-bet is 15 big blinds, we need effective stacks of at least 225 big blinds using the 15x rule. It's even less likely that a villain will stack off with such a big stack, so we might need a more conservative rule here, perhaps 20x. So we can adopt my baseline stack-off rules shown here. In a limped pot, we can always set mine, though this is not always our best action. When our call is small, such as 2.5 big blinds online, we can use the 12x rule. But when our call is medium, our baseline becomes the 15x rule. And when the call is large, we may be better off with using a 20x rule. Remember, these rules are for calling in a heads-up battle when we will have position. But we can be more liberal when we will be facing multiple villains on the flop. The more villains that see the flop, the better our immediate implied odds. As an extreme example, suppose the under the gun player opens to 4 big blinds and 5 players call. We are in the big blind, so we are getting about 24 to 3 odds, which is 8 to 1. This is already good enough for set mining, so the effective stacks don't matter at all. Or perhaps only 3 players call and we are on the button. Now we are getting 4 to 1 on a call, which is more than half the return we need to set mine. So our stack off rule can be much more relaxed. In this scenario, since we need to realize only half as much post-flop profit, our stack off rule could possibly be relaxed by about half, perhaps only 8x rather than 15x. But it's even better than that. With multiple villains on the flop, we are more likely to get action. On some flops, we may get action from several villains, and we are more likely to get multi-street action from at least one of them. This means that we can reduce our stack off rule considerably. It's difficult to model this, but perhaps we can approximate this by using a 16x rule, less 2x per villain. This would be 14x heads up and 12x three-way. We could also couple this with our bet size rule from the previous slide by relaxing our rule slightly when calling a small bet and tightening up the rule when we must call a large bet. The previous analysis assumed that we are playing our pair entirely for its set potential. We have assumed that we will only win if we flop a set, but this is not the full story. We should be able to claw back some of our set mining investment when we don't flop a set. The first way we can claw back some of our investment is with a free turn card. We will sometimes miss a flop and then it checks around. So we get a free turn card. And sometimes that happens to complete our set. It's difficult to model this scenario accurately, but the occasional turn set will reduce the profit we need when we do flop a set, probably to less than 7 to 1 in a low stakes cash game. We may also be able to win the hand unimproved. This depends primarily on our position, the number of villains, and our skill. Suppose we are heads up and in position against a weak villain. When a fit or fold villain checks when he misses, we can often take down the pot with a bet. Of course, clawback depends on the strength of our own post-flop play. We need to extract a lot of value when we miss the flop, which takes a lot of skill. It's possible that, rather than clawing back some of our investment, we could leak even more money to the villains. But even if we only claw back 1/7 of our investment, we reduce the set money return we need to be profitable, which is also going to reduce the stack off leverage we need to set mine. Some Vegas card rooms have bonuses or jackpot programs in place. It's not really a clawback, but it is another way we can reduce our stack off requirements for set mining. Many players dislike the presence of jackpots because they don't like paying the jackpot drop. But in Vegas, every dollar of the drop comes back to the players by way of jackpot payouts and bonuses. And since these are basically random, the jackpot drop does not hurt us at all, at least not directly. But many small stakes players make a mistake by trying to hit these jackpots. Those mistakes end up helping those of us who play correctly. But the presence of a bonus does help our stack off leverage to a small extent, since when we flop correctly, we will not only can we win money from our opponents, we get a small bonus from the card room. But these bonuses help only a little bit. Suppose we have pocket threes and the card room has a promotion with a $50 bonus for flopping a set of threes in the month of March. Then we can get a $50 pot sweetener when we flop the set, which would reduce the amount we need to win from the villains. But we should be very careful about this. We should usually play our baseline strategy even with the possibility of a bonus. Position is king in No Limit Hold'em. This is especially important when set mining because we need to extract a lot of value on our missed flops, which takes a lot of skill. In fact, if we are not skilled here, we can lose even more money than we had originally invested in our set mining attempt. Getting to see what the villains do before we must act is a huge advantage. So when we are out of position, we need a larger stack off potential, than our standard rules would imply. This is less important in multi-way pots, however. Even when we have position, we can't usually claw back much of our investment facing multiple villains, so being out of position is less harmful. Suppose we are facing a 4 big blind open. We might call this on the button because we can claw back some of our investment when the opener is weak. But we might fold when we are in the small blind, since it would be more difficult to win unimproved when we are out of position. But suppose we are facing a big blind open and 3 callers. We can call from the small blind now purely for set mining reasons. We have no intention in this case of trying to win this pot unimproved. So my general rule is to not set mine when out of position without the proper stack off leverage. We shouldn't expect to claw back any of our investment. One final point. The more players behind us, the less we should be willing to set mine. First, we are less likely to be able to win unimproved. This is because our lefties may also call, creating a multi-way pot in which we are out of position. We are also more likely to have to fold to a raise from one of the lefties. We should rarely call 3-bet after cold calling the original raiser. There is one final concept that we must consider: reverse implied odds. This is just the specter of flopping our set but losing anyway. This will happen occasionally. For example, we flop a bottom set of 2s. The villain c-bets, we raise, and the villain jams. We call, and we lose 80 big blinds to top set. Or we flop top set on a 10 of diamonds, 9 of diamonds, 2 of hearts board. We bet the flop and are called. The turn brings the king of hearts for a possible straight. The villain checks again and we bet. The villain calls and the river blanks. The villain jams and we call, losing to the straight, another big pot. Losing like this often results in large losses. This is one reason why we need a large stack-off leverage to play small pairs for set mining purposes, so that we can occasionally win a huge pot when things work out for us. The magnitude of our loss depends on our post-flop skills and reading ability. There is no reason we need to stack off every time this happens, especially when the stacks are fairly deep. Consider these last 2 examples. Should we have played these hands differently once the danger presented itself? Should we have been suspicious of villain number 2's betting sequence when he jams on the river? This is where our skill comes into play. One skill is to recognize that the more players in the hand, the more likely we'll flop a set and still lose the hand. So a dangerous board should ring a large bell when we face a lot of villains. Another skill is to realize that heavy action often implies a big hand, perhaps a hand bigger than our own. There is no shame in folding to an obviously bigger hand. We must also pay attention to the betting patterns. Checking the flop and the turn, followed by jamming on a safe river, could mean a busted draw, but it might also mean a monster. And most small stakes players don't make big bluffs on the river. We must also adjust our aggression based on the board texture. For example, we should slow down on some boards like 3 across or monochrome boards. Perhaps we check behind on the flop to keep this pot smaller. Perhaps we bet on the turn after the villain has checked a second time. Of course, we want to maximum win when we set mine. But this also can lead to maximum losses when we are beaten. We have to pay attention and not just blindly get it all in. Don't get married to your set. Although it's not actually part of a good set mining strategy, we should also know what we can do to defend against set miners. First, avoid providing the proper odds to a potential set miner by betting too small. For example, don't open to less than 4 big blinds or so in a small stakes cash game, such as $10 in a 1-3 game. Likewise, don't raise too small. Don't raise a single 1-3 limper to $10. Make it $15. Don't 3-bet a $10 open to $25. Make it $30 or even $35. If we do bet small, we should proceed cautiously against an aggressive post-flop player. Against a strong villain, we should avoid providing hints that his bottom set may not be good. But if a weak villain is never going to fold bottom set on a safe board, push it for all it's worth. This can also be a good strategy with a hidden straight, but even a weak villain can see a 3 flush board, so a bit of trickery may be in order then. Another defensive strategy is to make the set miner pay to play out of position. Of course, this is just the usual recommendation that we should always try to play in position ourselves. Basically, this strategy is simple. Make the villain pay a steep price to set mine. In low stakes games, they will often pay that price, which is profitable for us. Let's summarize what we've learned today. First, know the odds for flopping a set or better. This represents the nominal average return that we must realize in order to make set mining worthwhile. And this determines how many big blinds we must win to justify calling for set value. But that return assumes that we will win 7.3x every time we flop a set, which is clearly not possible. But the 15x rule is too simplistic, so we should consider using the 16x minus 2x per villain rule instead. This can be relaxed somewhat when the bet is small or when we think our opponent will stack off lightly. Next, we must consider whether our situation provides any clawback potential. This is more likely heads up, when we have position, and when our opponents are weak. And finally, we should be cautious when the board runs out bad. With possible straights and flushes, we should not try to maximize our profit. Remember, our win rate comes not only from the chips we win, but also from the chips we don't lose. Let's look at a few examples. We are under the gun with pocket twos on a passive 1-3 table. In this game, we typically see a lot of limpers and few raises. So we might be able to limp for set value even though this is contrary to what game theory recommends. Limping for set value is also attractive when the raises are usually too small and when the limpers often call such a raise. We don't need to worry about our table position, our poor table position in this situation because we will continue only if we flop a set. We don't need to worry about callback potential in this situation. Suppose the low jack raises are limped to $10 and the cutoff and button both call. It folds around to us. We should usually just call here. There is already $37 in the pot, and we only need to call another $7, which is about 5-to-1 odds when the rake is removed. We would then need to win another $24 when we do flop our set, and we have 3 villains that might give us enough action to accomplish this. Suppose an early position player limps and the hijack raises to $10. The hijack is known to be a weak player. It folds to us on the button with pocket sixes. We should call partially for set value. If 1 or 2 additional players call, we will have good set mining odds. If not, we have an excellent chance to claw back our investment when the flop misses our weak opponent. Suppose the under the gun player limps and a strong cutoff player raises to $15 in a 1-3 game. We are on the button with pocket fives. We should usually fold here. We must call a 5 big blind bet with 100 big blind stacks, which does satisfy the 15x rule, but this is a strong villain who won't likely stack off with a middling hand like top pair, top kicker. He might not even stack off with some 2-pair hands. And we are unlikely to claw back much of our investment when he misses the flop. We might even lose additional money to him. Let's avoid the strong players when set mining. As a final example, suppose a passive under the gun +1 player opens to $12, which is 4 big blinds. He has a 50 big blind starting stack. It folds to us in the small blind with pocket threes. This is a borderline folding hand. Our stack-off leverage is only about 13x, which is lower than our baseline 15x rule. But this situation is even worse than normal because we are out of position. So we will have a tough time clawing back any of our investment when the villain misses. This might have been a borderline call if the villain had opened to, say, $9 instead of 12. Since he is a passive player, he is probably opening with a very strong hand. So after a $9 open, we might be able to call because he's more likely to stack off with such a small stack. This lecture is primarily about set mining in cash games, but it might be interesting to see how this cash game strategy might apply to tournaments. First, tournaments are quite different than cash games. Bet sizes are often smaller, which can be good for set mining, but stack sizes are also smaller, at least after the first few levels. So it's not uncommon to face a 2.5 big blind bet with only 25 big blind effective stacks. Additionally, tournament players are often unwilling to stack off lightly, so it seems that tournament set mining may be unprofitable in most situations. But how do we define profitable in a tournament? Unlike in cash games, tournaments are not always about making positive chip EV decisions. For example, ICM can make set mining even less profitable, since the ICM meme is that the chips we win are less valuable than the chips we lose. But chip utility can more than make up for the ICM penalty, at least when we are not near the bubble. When we double up in a tournament, the extra chips can provide a power that is much greater than the statistical value that an ICM model predicts. So it can be worthwhile taking negative chip EV lines when the upside of flopping a set can be so large. So we should generally raise or fold with the small or medium pairs when it is clearly the best play. But rather than folding in some cases, we can sometimes call with the primary intention of set mining when the upside of doubling up is very large. A version of this lecture was presented at the Las Vegas Wednesday Poker Discussion Group in April of 2024. You can join us every Wednesday at Tommy Rocker's, and you can join our Facebook group where you can find out about our next meeting. That's all for now, folks.